Evet, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Yoğun program devam ediyor. Gerçekten içerikler olarak ve çeşitlilikler olarak bu sene çok daha iyi bir durumdayız. Amacımız da her sene çok daha iyi olmak. Çok kıymetli, çok değerli bir konuğumuz var, hocamız var. Sayın Profesör Edmund Sonuga-Barke. Gerçekten özellikle çocuk ruh sağlığı alanında değişik, ilginç bir başlıkla bize bir sunum yapacak. Kendisi ruh sağlığı alanında, çocuk ruh sağlığı alanında, çocuk özellikle gelişimsel psikoloji anlamında dersler veriyor. Bu bizim için ekstra kıymetli. Çünkü bu nörogelişimsel bozuklukların özellikle süreç içerisinde nöroçeşitlilik bağlamında ele alınmasında çok kıymetli bir bakış açısı. Tabii asıl bence ilginç olan, biraz da kendimde de gördüğüm, kendimi de bu anlamda belki de niye bu alana da bu kadar yoğunlaştığım özeti olan, kendi hayat hikayesiyle ilişkilendirip bu meselenin, bu konunun üzerinde durması, bu olayı biraz daha açıkçası bizim açımızdan farklı, değişik ve ilginç hale getiriyor. Güzel bir sunum olacağı kanaatindeyim. İnşallah sizlerde de daha sonra katkı ve sorular alacağız. Ben kendisine geldiği için, bizimle birlikte olduğu için ve bilgilerini bizimle paylaştığı için öncelikle teşekkür etmek istiyorum. Size de teşekkür ederiz katıldığınız için. Professor Barke, the stage is all yours. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for this very generous invitation. Is this box necessary here? Sorry, is it? No, just put it in. Sorry, there was a box there, sorry. Sorry, it's now here. Good. Thanks. Great, yeah, thank you so much. You're very kind. And a wonderful Turkish hospitality that I've experienced since I've been here. Absolutely brilliant. What an incredible hotel. It's enormous. I can't believe it. So big. I've never seen so many swimming pools in one hotel. That's amazing. Anyway, ADHD remains a controversial and a contested concept. There's discussions about what it is and how you should treat it. And we started, many years ago, probing those issues around ADHD. And a couple of years ago, a journalist from the New York Times contacted me, Paul Tuff, and he interviewed me 3 times, serious stuff. And we put together this article in the New York Times entitled, "Have We Been Thinking About ADHD All Wrong?" And I kind of described where I'd got to in my thinking about ADHD. And some of the quotes that are in the paper had quite a reaction, mainly from my colleagues. We've a clinical definition of ADHD that is increasingly unanchored from what we are finding in our science. Oh dear. I don't see medication as a medical treatment for a medical condition. Oh dear. Many of my colleagues were quite upset by these sorts of quotes. They were just a genuine, honest expression of where I've got with my science over 30, 35 years, at the cutting edge of ADHD science, neuroscience, genetics, and so forth. And so, in a way, the talk I'm going to give today is to put this in context. Why did I make these? Well, I just didn't think of provocative, but turned out to be provocative statements. I haven't been cancelled completely by my colleagues, but they were not pleased. So the outline of my talk is, first of all, focusing on why I do science. So this is not metaphysics, this is not astrophysics, this is a very practical science. If we're not helping people with ADHD to live better lives, then my science has been futile. And it's fair to say we haven't had so much influence on ADHD people's lives from a scientific perspective. See, I'm not a clinician, I'm just a scientist. So, this is the purpose of why I do science. It needs to be translated into the benefit, for the benefit of people with ADHD. Then I'm going to introduce the concept of a paradigm and argue that ADHD fulfills many of the criteria for a shift in paradigm, a new way of thinking about ADHD that we captured a little bit in that New York Times article. And the paradigm we're going to explore then is this so-called neurodiversity concept. And that's moving from seeing ADHD as a disease, or at least a disorder, which I just think of as a disease that you don't know the cause of, to thinking of it as a form of neurodivergence in the spectrum of expression in life's rich tapestry. So two very different paradigms. And what are the implications of making that switch for science, first of all, and secondly, of course, for practice? So that's what I'm going to explore. This isn't a sales job. This is an exploration of concepts to see if there's any benefit for us to move to a new paradigm. What are the implications, as I've just said? And then I'm going to introduce a thing that I'm very proud of, I think the most exciting program of research that I've been involved with over all these years. It's called Restar. And it's just come to an end. The first phase of funding just come to an end. And it's kind of like a study of what science might look like from a neurodiversity paradigm perspective. So it's like playing out, working out, as we're going along, how your hypotheses and your methods are informed by this new paradigm. As they have been, of course, by the old paradigm. Our hypotheses, our research questions, our methods are all dictated by the paradigm within which we work. How do they change when you go from one paradigm, disorder, to another paradigm, divergence? That's the question that I'm kind of become fascinated in. And I do think, spoiler alert, I do think that the 4 years of Restart has provided a new vision for the science of neurodivergence, that is ADHD, and in this case, autism, actually. So let's get back to basics. Put us in context. Remind myself more than anything. Why do we treat kids with ADHD? Why is it a treatable thing? Well, because of course we know, at the phenotypic level, clusters of extreme inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity that are persistent and pervasive, undermining of daily functioning and creating distress, can also negatively impact lifespan development, create burden for patients, families, and communities, and increase costs to healthcare, criminal justice, social welfare, and lots of different societal systems. That's why we treat. That's why it's a treatable thing. Just to remind me, why do we do research then? Why have I spent 35 years, apart from it being great fun and very interesting, but what's the real reason? Of course, the real reason is ADHD care has not changed in 30 to 40 years. Actually, the period that coincides with my research career. So I'm not sure that's a good thing. It still basically rests on medication as a very pragmatic means to control symptoms. That's essentially what the medication does, and it does it effectively or with efficacy. Loads of trials have shown this, and some of them even funded some trials funded not by pharmaceutical companies even show efficacy. So improvements in care aren't anything to do with science. They've actually, or new treatments, they've largely been due to better drug delivery systems. So the big thing about 15 years ago, whenever it was, Concerta came along. You got extended release, brilliant concept, nothing to do with ADHD science. If anything, something to do with pharmaceutical mechanics. You know, so we can't claim that as a product of translational science in ADHD. And of course, the dissemination of best practice. So everywhere's got guidelines now that regulate the practice of clinicians based on the best evidence, which often isn't that good, but it's the best we've got. So in England, we have the so-called NICE guidelines. So some of you might have heard of that. And they've become quite a universal standard in a way. So influencing those guidelines is really important if you want to change care practice. However, there's lots of limitations still. Key impairments are unresolved by medication. We did lots of research on the impact of medication, randomized trials, on school achievement and school academic productivity. Very minimal effects in our trials. And that is reflected across a whole range of functional domains, to be honest. Bit of a mystery. You can show the behavioral effects, symptom effects. You don't see the functional extension very often. Long-term benefits are still uncertain. The data from the so-called famous MTA study is very unclear what the benefits are in the long term. Obviously, the long-term follow-ups aren't in a randomized design, but still, if you correlate the exposure to medication and you look at the outcomes, there's not much relationship in that trial. So that's kind of a challenge for the field. Obviously, there's a whole stuff around adverse effects, adverse events, side effects, very common but manageable, largely. Some rare and more dangerous ones, obviously. And then, of course, there's a whole thing, and I'm ashamed to say I don't know the situation in Turkey, but there are some countries where just using medication to treat children's behavior is considered inappropriate. So there's lots of structural barriers as well. So Italy was always the country that was very cautious about using medication. And as you probably know, the World Health Organization list of essential medications does not include ADHD medications. And there's a big fight going on about it at the moment. So there's lots of barriers still to this treatment. So, long story short, we still need science-driven therapeutic innovation. There's loads to do in terms of improving the lives of people with ADHD over and above the benefits of medication, which I'm not denying. So, obviously, if you're a scientist and if you're a rational person, you're going to base innovation on evidence and scientific discovery. And we call that translational science. If we can understand the mechanisms underpinning the condition, whatever they are, whether they're biological mechanisms, whether they're environmental processes, then we can target those mechanisms and mitigate the effects of the condition. That's a translational approach. That's what drives scientists in the ADHD field, or one of the main drivers anyway, lots of other ones, of course, but this should be the main driver. This is what we should be interested in, and what we probably haven't really achieved. And I call it the paradox of progress, because when we started out, like when I started out in 89, working with Eric Taylor, very famous, inspiring hero of mine at the Institute of Psychiatry, we thought it was going to be a really simple journey. We thought, this is a simple thing, ADHD is not that complicated, and the kind of destination, maybe the front row here. This is what we're trying to achieve. Actually, through the science, what we've learned is the destination is through the back door out there, up 3 flights of stairs in one of the kind of corner bedrooms is a long journey to go. And we've understood that only from doing the science. So it's actually the more we've learned, this is the paradox, the more we've learned, the further our destination seems away. So it's not a linear path. It's kind of probably convoluted, and we really don't know where we're going still, after all these years. So how we unblock progress. That was nice. How we unblock progress. Well, lots of people say lots of different things. If they recognize the block, I mean, all causes denial goes on in any scientific field. Lots of gaslighting, oh, we never believed that anyway, and things aren't as bad as you say, Ed, blah, blah, blah, blah. The truth is we've made no real contribution to the lives of people. So that, to me, that's the paradox. Better technology, yeah, we'll get throughput of sequencing much quicker, and we'll get bigger magnets, and yeah, it's probably important, but I don't think it's the key issue. Bigger data, everybody loves big data now because we've got these incredibly powerful algorithms. We can crunch through millions and millions of bits of data. I'm a skeptic, to be honest, about the value of that. Still has to be interpreted, but it's probably important. Everybody wants more data than less data, so I'm not dismissing it. Better science, more reproducible, hypothesis-driven work, protocols, really important, but I'm not sure it's going to break the problem. The one I'm interested in, because I love to look at things in different ways, is looking at ADHD in a different way than we have traditionally. Perhaps that will break through this barrier to translational progress. And of course, in science, the way we look at something is called a paradigm. And what is a paradigm? Because this is crucial to the talk, but also crucial to progress in our field. Understanding the power of the paradigm to shape our research and to promote alternative types of research. This is the paradigm guy. You all know him, I'm sure. He's one of two famous philosophers of science, I think, Popper and Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn, paradigm guy, and he argued that scientific progress is only possible if you have a stable framework of assumptions about the thing you're studying. So the fact we all agree, for instance, that those are stairs or steps, means we can talk about them. We can hypothesize about them. We can compare one against another, but we agree the concept. So we can communicate. So the assumptions provide an essential bridge of meaning between scientists and clinicians in our area, practical science, and also involving patients. So the fact we agree on what ADHD is means we can study it, essentially. That's the power of the paradigm. But the even more important power of the paradigm is it constrains what you do. It says what you take for granted is true, like you assume it, it's an assumption, and what can you still study? What are your key research questions? What are your hypotheses? What methods are you going to use? And how are you going to interpret your findings? They're all controlled and constrained by your paradigm, the way you look at something. You look at ADHD as a disorder, it impacts every stage of the scientific process through to interpretation. And hopefully I'll illustrate that. So our paradigm is that we've worked with for all these years is the disorder paradigm. The idea that ADHD, well, the key is, of course, in the name, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Can't gaslight on that. It's clearly thought of as a disorder. What's a disorder? So what are these assumptions within the disorder paradigm that have shaped our science? First of all, ADHD is congenital. A mix of prenatal and genetic factors interact to create a risk propensity for ADHD that is activated throughout the life. So it's congenital and unfolding across the time. So it's a neurodevelopmental condition. It's mediated by a distinctive and a discrete pattern of intrinsic dysfunction. Dysfunction is the core of the mental disorder concept in the DSM-5 and pretty much everywhere else. that is manifest specifically as ADHD, differing from other kinds of conditions, such as autism, such as depression, such as normality, in qualitatively distinct ways. These are all assumptions implicit in the concept that ADHD is a disorder. And that, by extension, creates impairment. Impairment is incredibly tightly linked to dysfunction in these models, to the extent that impairment is seen as evidence for dysfunction. And you can see the problem with a little bit of logic there. This is very, very circular. Because we can't measure the dysfunction in the brain, we haven't identified biomarkers, dysfunctional related biomarkers, we assume it's dysfunctional because it creates impairment. So impairment is not only the key marker of dysfunction, it's its consequence, which gets you into a bit of a loop of logical circularity. Anyway, that's not the point of today's talk. So what is your translational model here? It's lovely and linear and clear, and that's why it's been so powerful in terms of persuading people of its value. You target the underlying dysfunction. Fix the brain, reduce the symptoms, resolve the impairment. Really simple model. I mean, of course, the brain is really complex, but the model is really simple. So understanding the source of brain dysfunction becomes the primary focus for science. And that's what it has been, whether it's to do with the biogenetic factors, whether it's to do with the brain structure and function, etc., etc. And the environment has been really played down in ADHD, core mainstream ADHD science, which is very interesting. Of course, you can't do a talk on ADHD without mentioning Russell Barkley, a wonderfully brilliant scientific communicator. And his is the classic expression of this. So if people say to me, well, nobody really believes that, Ed, well, Russ did. And he developed a theory that maps very well onto this paradigm. Basically, the idea that at the core of ADHD is a failure with inhibitory brain systems that is expressed as executive dysfunction, that leads to a whole range, cascade of cognitive difficulties and self-regulatory difficulties. So for Russ, ADHD is a disorder of executive function. Perfect example of the disorder paradigm theory. I'm not decrying it. There's some evidence that the parts of it are true. In general, I would say it's probably not true. Well, I've spent a lot of time arguing it's not true, so I'm not going to change now. But there is certainly correlations between executive function and ADHD. But that's just to give you an illustration. And of course, in his model, what you're targeting is executive dysfunction, either through pharmacology or through, say, cognitive training and so forth. So the key thing then, the question today is, are we ripe for a paradigm shift? Is the ADHD field ripe for a paradigm shift? Or should we just carry on in our current way of doing science, way of thinking about translational science? So according to Kuhn, of course, this was a revolutionary part of Kuhn's model. Science was a social, in a way, a developmental phenomena for Kuhn. And it went through a series of phases. And you had what he called normal science. That's like hypothesis testing. Then you vary your hypothesis, you get positive or negative feedback, and then you go around. But then, as evidence is acquired, information acquired about the thing you're studying, you start to realize, hang on a minute, this paradigm isn't really supported by much of the evidence that we're coming up with. And he called that crisis. So science then enters a crisis period. And then, rather than going back to the old paradigm, you come up with a new paradigm. And you say, the old paradigm wasn't working, let's have a big step change and come up with a new way of looking at the phenomena. And so the question is ADHD ready for that? Is there a crisis in ADHD science? I may be in the minority, but I think there's a crisis. And there's two reasons why I think there's a crisis. The first and most fundamental is around the translational value of the paradigm. Has it produced new approaches to the treatment or the support of people with ADHD? Secondly, of course, this is more Kuhnian. What about the scientific credibility of the paradigm? Does the data, is it reconcilable at least with the paradigm, or does it contradict the paradigm? Yeah? You need a new paradigm. So what about the clinical data? Now, there have been attempts at translating basic science to the support of people with ADHD. One of them is cognitive training. Really clever stuff, founded in basic neuroscience, all the hallmarks of translational science. Then, of course, and the goal of that, of course, is strengthen brain networks through targeted and scaffolded task activity. And those networks in particular implicated in ADHD as far as we know. The second one, of course, is neurofeedback. Again, science-driven research based on basic science of ADHD. This time, of course, it's about regulating brain activity through the visualization and reinforcement of cortical signals. There's one basic problem with these brilliant approaches. Neither of them work. So here's the two meta-analyses that we recently put together, European ADHD guidelines. I kind of lead on the psychological interventions for the European ADHD guidelines group. And we have one for cognitive training and meta-analysis. We have one for neurofeedback. And you can see these are the pooled effect sizes. Marginally significant and very small, of all probably no clinical significance. And you've got to put it against what Jim Swanson calls the Ritalin ruler of an effect size of 1 for basic methylphenidate. So this has become a dead end. Now, I'm not saying they can't be made to work based on new scientific insights, but at the moment, bad news is, and it's bad news for me because I'm involved in these areas of study and development, they don't work. So that model hasn't delivered therapeutic innovation of value. Sorry. And it's pretty much, there's lots of proposed interventions that are based on science, and it may not be neuroscience, it may be other forms of science. For instance, meditation people talk about, mindfulness. Once you put them to a rigorous randomized control test with blinded outcomes, there are almost never any significant benefits, I'm afraid. Bad news. Don't shoot the messenger. I actually had a talk called Don't Shoot the Messenger once when I was talking about this. Reality check 2, lack of scientific credibility. So remember the assumptions, the core assumptions about discrete brain networks, about the relationship with impairment, and so forth. So ADHD doesn't have those hallmarks. It's an overlapping continua. It's not a discrete and specific category. And the underlying pathophysiology is shared with lots of other conditions. No, really hard to discern boundaries pathophysiologically between these different conditions. Whoops. So that's the first, this is just a very short summary of lots and lots of research that we've reviewed, and people interested, I can send my own research and other people's research. And the other, of course, that within ADHD, you haven't got a single condition. There are multiple underlying pathophysiological signatures for different people with different ones. I introduced the dual pathway model in 2002. We did the triple pathway model in 2010. And I think we're up to probably 12 pathways now or something. These are incredibly heterogeneous condition. Now, it's not unique in any of these things. You can look at most of the other neurodevelopment conditions and you'll see a very similar pattern, which kind of suggests the paradigm, at least, is being challenged in terms of its credibility. And maybe we need a different model. I'm going the wrong way, sorry. So is it time to explore different paradigms? And what paradigms are out there to explore? Well, the one that I'm fascinated by is the one that is a completely different way of looking at ADHD. And I wrote an editorial in the Journal of Child Psychology and Psychiatry. I had an advantage because I'm actually editor-in-chief, so I got the editorial published. Nobody would have published it probably, but it's called Paradigm Flipping. And it's the idea that by looking at something in a different way, you can reinvigorate your scientific study. And in particular, I focus on neurodiversity. Not because I've got any particular attachment to it, it just seemed like it could provide a coherent framework for study. Now, human beings are obviously very good at looking at the same thing in different ways. Everybody knows this example. You can see the old lady, I'm not sure she's old, but anyway, the one with the big nose, or you can see the little lady whose nose, her nose is the chin and then her little nose. And as soon as you see that both of them, you flip between them. You're not constrained to take one. So paradigm flipping isn't really paradigm shifting, it's just a scientific tactic. Let's just make ourselves look at this in a different way and see what the implications are. And we can, of course, do the same thing with ADHD. Function or dysfunction, disorder or divergence. So it's really clear, you've got to be really clear, this is about the framing and the implications of framing things in a different way. You can't, in a way, test. These aren't hypotheses to test. They're framing that derive hypotheses. So what is neurodiversity? Now, this is a controversial topic and gets everybody all upset. And the thing is, it's a very complex and multi-layered concept. On the face of it, it's a rights-based self-advocacy movement that is. Nobody could disagree with this version of it because it's all about the dignity and value, intrinsic value of neurodivergent people, about empowerment and self-esteem, removing stigma, using language that isn't violent against people, etc., etc. And also highlighting possible strengths within a group of people that have been considered disordered for a long time. So I think very few people would disagree with this unless they really are kind of stuck in the old way of thinking. But on a deeper level, it's got very clear philosophical foundations that we can exploit to develop a paradigm. And it's really important, and we were just chatting about it before, because this becomes a very ideological area. I want to park the ideological issues and focus on the ontological issues. What does the neurodiversity say about the nature of ADHD? Not about the liberation of neurodivergent people. So the ideological issue is very much aligned with intersectional models of social justice, which one may or may not agree with from a political perspective, moral or political perspective. And the goal then is not therapeutic, it's to change the world, to liberate neurodivergent people from the neurotypical tyranny. That is the ideological level within the neurodiversity concept. And in fact, it's very critical of translational science because it doesn't see the goal as changing the person. So there's nothing we can learn of value from the strict ideological perspective. Ontologically, it gives us a different framework. It contains a new perspective on the nature of neurodevelopmental conditions and how to study them. It offers a chance to flip the paradigm to potentially invigorate our translational science, new focus and new hypotheses, and to change ADHD people from the object of study to the subject, active participants in the study. And this is what I'm going to try and illustrate the power of. So what happens when we flip? So here's the disorder model, simplified, and not that it's a straw man, but it's simplified. What happens when we flip? It took me ages to figure out how to move that across the screen. Not easy. Sometimes I get a round of applause for that, but it's okay if you don't want to. Thank you. And then, so what happens? Well, of course you go, reframing, same brain, but it goes from being thought of as a dysfunctional brain to being an atypical brain. The symptoms become not an expression of dysfunction, but a difference in thinking and acting and, in fact, being as a person. Impairment isn't a direct extension of the dysfunction anymore. It's a consequence of the interplay between the person and their context. And in particular, the misalignment of the neurodivergent way of thinking and being to their context. So it doesn't take a genius to figure out where the scientific inquiry flips to. If the cause is in the intersection between the person and their environment, and the mismatch or misalignment, or the undermining and destructive nature of that environment for the neurodivergent person, then that's where you focus. Doesn't mean you're no longer interested in the person, or in their brains, or in their genes, but it's very much at that intersection is the nexus of study. This is at least as it appears to me from just the logic of this situation. And of course, the translational imperative changes as well. You go from understanding the brain to fixing it, to understanding this misalignment. What is it about the person? What is it about a particular environment that creates this spiral of decline? So that you can reverse that and create what I call an arc of growth. So the goal isn't to reduce symptoms anymore. The goal is to promote thriving and flourishing in ADHD people. Sounds a little bit like a fairy story, particularly at the coalface in the clinic with ADHD people. But this seems a logical conclusion of the neurodiversity paradigm and the neurodivergence concept. Promote an arc of growth by aligning environments and nurturing ADHD people's self-concept, sense of agency, resilience, and so forth. Now, medication can play a role in that, of course. But your outcome isn't symptom reduction, it's growth. So, yeah, my golly, have I been talking all that time already? So, I kind of came up with I got invited to write a book chapter for the annual review of clinical psychology, and it was supposed to be about strengths-based approaches to ADHD. So I thought it's a great opportunity to try and develop a model of flourishing in neurodivergence. And so, as you can see, neurodivergence at the top in this context, non-affirmative or non-nurturing, let's call it, on the one side, affirmative and nurturing on the other. One creates a spiral of decline, and at the core of that, the kind of foundation of that, based on personal experience, based on talking to neurodivergent people with ADHD, is this validation of self in the world. Am I accepted for who I am? Are my strengths and needs understood and supported? Am I worthy? Am I of intrinsic value as a person? Am I capable? Am I trusted? ADHD people talk about, nobody trusts me. I'm just going to let them down. I don't trust myself either, to be honest. So you can see that creates an invalidation of the self. That then leads on to difficulties in a lack of agency. Your attributional style in the world is a learned helplessness sort of style. I can't do anything. Nobody trusts me. I don't trust myself. Nothing I do is going to change anything. And then, of course, that leads through into a lack of resilience, unable to deal with difficulties. But crucially, I like to flip it to more positive, but also unable to take advantage of opportunities to be resourceful and contribute to society. Of course, the other way, this is obviously fantasy, but it's an illustration of the two extremes, I guess. It's always going to be a mixture. But the extreme definitely exists with many people with ADHD. So within an affirmative, nurturing, and aligned environment, caricature, but accepted and valued, strong self-concept, confident and trusting of yourself and other people, which is crucial, of course, self-efficacious and resilient, coping with stress, able to take advantage of opportunities, etc. So that kind of a simplified model of human flourishing. Okay, so what about Restart? My most recent favorite thing, for lots of reasons. One of them being the logo. I'm going to give you that again. You can see I get very bored on rainy Saturday afternoon. So, yeah. So it's called Regulating Emotion, Strengthening Adolescent Resilience. And I've put a subheading, a research adventure in neurodiversity-inspired science. So this, to me, is what science might look like if you take this flip seriously. Funded by the Medical Research Council, very fortunate. We're one of 7 large programs of research that they funded around adolescent mental health. And our focus was on autism and ADHD. And we started out with a very different perspective than we ended up. In fact, we started out with the disorder model, because that's where I was. To be honest. The development of these ideas has come over the last 3 or 4 years, as I've worked with my colleagues in Restart, as much as anything, and understanding the power, or potential positive power of taking a different perspective, not denying that other perspectives are possible, but taking how does that influence what we do. So the goal here was from the UKRI, that's the MRC, that's our funding body in the UK, was to understand mental health risk, mechanisms to promote intervention, innovation in relation to mental health, adolescents. Our initial offer was, we're going to focus on emotional dysregulation, because that's the bit of the brain that's broken in people with ADHD that leads through to depression and anxiety. So you can see that's a classic disorder paradigm model. Our initial rationale, of course, was that adolescence is a risk period for depression or anxiety and mental health problems. Neurotypical people, it's exacerbated in neurodivergent people, and within that group, it's concentrated in those with so-called emotional dysregulation. And our logic was, this is classic disorder-based logic, strengthen emotion regulation, you'll cut the risk for depression. So that was our logic. That's what we put forward to the MRC. And our initial hypothesis was kind of simple, that autism and ADHD lead to mental health because of emotion dysregulation. That could be in a whole range of different areas of emotion regulation, metacognition, executive control, emotion processing, blah, blah, blah, blah. And autism and ADHD have lots of overlapping areas of emotional difficulty, but they also have some unique and distinctive ones. Interestingly, alexithymia, the inability to recognize emotions, everybody says it's actually an autism thing. We actually found equal levels in our ADHD group as well, which is kind of interesting. So a lot of the assumptions about autism weren't borne out in our study. So this was our initial plan. This is what we got the money for. But the UKRI told us 2 things that changed everything. First of all, they said it had to be multidisciplinary. Now, usually I interpret that as you've got to get a psychiatrist and a psychologist to work together. But they didn't mean that. They meant you've got to bring people who disagree with you into the group. So we had applied theatre experts. We had people very grounded in youth participation. and a very qualitative understanding. You know, I didn't agree with them at the start at all about anything. Brought them together. The other thing they said is got to have youth participation. It's got to have public patient, whatever they call it. Young people had to be involved in the study. And my colleagues from all these other traditions said, and I said, oh, yeah, we'll get them on a committee and they can comment every 6 months. He said, oh, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to do something totally radical. We're going to bring these young people with autism and ADHD into the research program and place them at the core of the study. I thought, my gosh, that sounds like a lot of hard work. And it was. But my gosh, it certainly delivered enormous benefits. So cost benefit, absolutely favorable. Although it's kind of scary what we did, and other people say it's not really practicable, but you'll see. So that changed everything. And we created this, what I call a band of neurodiverse adventurer scientists. And that is also because many of the academic researchers had diagnoses of autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, dyslexia, whatever. So it was truly a neurodivergent group of people. And out of that, chemistry, we forged what we think is a new translational science of neurodiversity. Moving on. So what are the key things? Well, of course, it changes what you study. I've already illustrated that. So in rejecting the concept of disorder, dysfunction, it flips the focus to person-environment alignment, misalignment. So that's what you study now, not brain dysfunction, misalignment within the environment. But it also changes how you study. It's completely revolutionary. Those two things together are very powerful. And we call it deep participation. So the insights and the experience of neurodivergent people at the core of Restar, at the core of our science. It's a science study. This isn't sort of a qualitative study, it's a science study. So in terms of deep participation, I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, and I did a little talk recently on it. What do neurodivergent people bring to science? Well, of course, we know in ordinary science, in science, technology, engineering, and whatever the other one is, loads of famous scientists are neurodivergent. From Einstein, nobody quite knows what his form of neurodivergence was, there's probably many, through a whole range of Nobel Prize winners, either diagnosed or undiagnosed. Dyslexia, autism, ADHD. But what about for this science? Well, it also brings in what I call neuroaffinity. Sorry, that's the wrong thing. You have experience of the condition, you have insights into the condition, you have empathy with those affected by the condition, and you have motivation to get on with it and work really hard to solve the problem. So there's both neurodiversity benefits and neuroaffinity benefits for involving neurodivergent people in the science. From an ethical perspective, it does, I think, keep you very honest, because the community is there in the study, at the meetings, in the work groups, collecting the data. So integrity, accountability, respect, and transparency. And we put this all together in a paper that we published in the British Journal of Psychiatry, very august and old-fashioned journal. Not quite sure how we got it published there, but this is our framework and model. And it starts with the concept of co-intentional, which comes out of applied theatre, which is that everybody, whatever level, works together to the common goal. That involves flattening your power hierarchy. So I was the chief investigator of the study, but we had to work in a very horizontal power structure, respecting everybody's input, accepting the value of different people's input, not in a kind of lip service way, but in a profound way. That's not easy, particularly in science. Everybody loves the old hierarchies. We lost a few along the way, actually, I have to say, who couldn't do this. Of course, we want to open up expertise by science to expertise by experience. We want to combine those two forms of knowledge. Again, controversial. Some people don't like it, and so forth. And we want to, as I've just mentioned, enhance neurotypical science by bringing a neurodivergent mind to bear in terms of creativity, in terms of unorthodox thinking, and so forth. And this is second round of applause. I want more than 3 people, please. We got the paper of the year. Thank you. Thank you. Stop. Sorry. I'm always joking. I apologize. Yeah, we got Editor's Choice, British Journal of Psychiatry. So we were pretty overwhelmed. And it was I think it's great credit to the whole team. So at the core of this approach is the so-called Youth Researcher Panel. And these are all the young people diagnosed with autism or ADHD, or both, that we've worked with over the last 4 years. It's only the first names because some didn't want surnames, some didn't want pictures, so I took the lowest common denominator so they could all be equal. But they have to say they've been absolutely incredible. And we call them the Youth Researcher Panel, the YRAP. So we actually call them the YRAPers. And what have they done? So they've been with us developing hypotheses, bringing their insights to bear on the science, on the literature, working together. Obviously, they've not necessarily got all the tools you acquire through a scientific career in terms of formulating things in a precise way, but certainly in terms of developing new ideas, new methods, particularly relevant when you're collecting data from neurodivergent people, to have neurodivergent people tell you what's helpful. So lots and lots of creative methods in terms of painting we used, in terms of prose writing, into a whole range of things. Oh, I didn't finish that one, sorry. In terms of data collection, so we trained them. So not just qualitative, but that was really important. We did qualitative stuff. We developed a new protocol for co-interviewing between neurodivergent young people and academic researchers. The benefits or difficulties of that we talked about, but also in neuroscience. So some of them became quite adept at getting them caps, those EEG caps on very quickly. So, interpreting that data. So you can see the investment that's required for this, and it will be more difficult in other areas, perhaps, than this area. So deep participation, yeah. So it changed what you study and why you study. So it focused on environment, alignment between the person and the environment. But what aspects of the environment are important in terms of mental health? And what characteristics of the person are important in mental health? It's both of them together. And then, of course, in terms of deep participation, well, pretty obvious. Let's talk to neurodivergent people and develop some hypotheses. That's what we did. And so we had part 1 of Restart, My Emotions and Me. Co-interviewed 57 young people, so 12, 13-year-olds with autism and or ADHD, and lots of interesting stuff came out. It gave us a very new insight on emotion dysregulation. Most importantly, they talked a lot about how common upsetting experiences were in their lives. And they talked about how intensely they reacted to those upsetting experiences. So, that's interesting. 2 things we might want to explore a bit more. Maybe we want to develop a hypothesis about this. Interestingly, the autistic people and the ADHD people had obviously different events that triggered these emotions, but there were also a lot of commonalities too. So this has all now been published, and it's a bit of the art from one of the studies. So we co-created a hypothesis together, bringing our own particular insights and skills to that process. And our hypothesis became, rather than saying people with ADHD and autism get depressed because they can't regulate their emotions, old disorder. So I shouldn't say old, the disorder model, the disorder paradigm. 2, the accumulation of high levels of common upsetting events, where the boundaries with trauma are, is kind of interesting. but we call them common upsetting events, intensely experienced, creates emotional burden. The accumulation of emotional burden that neurodivergent people carry. That's an insight that came out of Restart. And it's obviously a source of significant unhappiness in itself. It's actually, by definition, it's a source of unhappiness by itself, some setting of experiences. But it also potentially has it could be a risk for later mental health problems. So you can see we flipped the mechanism from something intrinsic, deficits in emotion dysregulation, to something transactional between the environment and the person. So we've gone from this little, if you remember this one, to this one. Accumulated emotional burden as a function of the interplay between upsetting experiences and intensely felt. And crucially, they couldn't stop talking about school. That school is a major source of emotional burden in neurodivergent adolescents. That's what we came up with. It may not be in other cultures, but in the UK, that's definitely the case. Now, something about our schools, maybe, and it may be in other cultures not the same thing. That also highlights actually very culturally, contextually dependent. We looked at emotional burden in China as well. I have a post in Hong Kong. So we did a study comparing Hong Kong to UK, and totally different things were burdensome. All around academics in Hong Kong. In UK, academics isn't mentioned once. It's all about relationships and teachers being a pain in the arse and blah, blah, blah, blah. But in Hong Kong, it's all about, oh, my mum's going to get upset because I've not got the grades and so forth. Really interesting. So you probably need a different emotional burden scale in different places. So we basically came up with a way to measure emotional burden. And we call it the MESSI, because emotions are messy. And it's called the My Emotions in School inventory. And it's 25 commonly upsetting events as identified with our young youth research panel based on our interviews, et cetera, so co-developed. And we ask how frequent these are in your life. We ask how upsetting they are, how intense would your emotional reaction be to them, and then we calculate an emotional burden index, frequency times intensity, for these 25 commonly upsetting events, cues, commonly upsetting events. And here's just a few of them, I won't read them out. But there's a lot about school staff, and again, that might be a typically British thing, I don't know. There's a lot about other kids being mean and cruel. There's quite a lot about, obviously, there's some about stimulation. Not surprisingly, talking about autism and ADHD, either under or over, depending, and so forth. Boring comes out as a commonly upsetting event. Now you think, that's not very traumatic, being bored, but it does feed into this effect. And this is all on that. By the way, if anybody interested in this, we haven't got a Turkish version, so there was an opportunity there, if people are interested, to look at this, Turkish schools. It's all on the old app, so it's all easy to fill in. And what do we find? Large study, you can see the numbers, 100 people with ADHD. So these are early adolescents, so like 11, 12, 13. 100 students with ADHD, 100 with autism, 79 with both ADHD and autism, and 452 neurotypical kids. And you can see, it doesn't take a statistician to see that we've got really quite a profound result. That the levels of school-based emotional burden are at least twice as high in our neurodivergent kids, in our neurotypical kids. Interestingly, even in the neurotypical group, they rank them quite similarly to the neurodivergent kids, but just much lower in terms of both frequency and intensity. So this is not a marginal result. This is doubling of emotional burden in our neurodivergent kids. So that kind of fits in with our hypothesis. Interestingly, there were these are the triggers. These are the items that were particularly highly rated by our ADHD kids and our autistic kids. Many of them are quite similar, although they rank slightly differently. There are some that are distinctive, not as many as we thought. So the autistic and ADHD students not only have the same level of overall burden, these are all diagnosed cases, they actually have many of the same triggers for upset in the classroom. But is this actually important? Well, I'm going to test that now. So how does it relate to depression and anxiety? So here's the regression model. This is cross-sectional data. We're doing a longitudinal study, as I'll mention a bit later on. And you can see that in the emotional burden, and we added in emotion regulation deficits as measured by the so-called DERS. If you know the literature, you'll know the DERS. It's the most commonly used emotion regulation deficit questionnaire. And you can see they make significant and independent contributions to mental health. At this point, it could have all gone pear-shaped, because we might have found that emotional burden is just an epiphenomena of emotion regulation, or another bit of emotion regulation. So when you put them together, it doesn't carry any of the variance. It's not the case. It makes a significant independent contribution to anxiety and depression. Interestingly, we also looked at another outcome which we were fascinated with. I don't know what about Turkey, but since COVID in the UK, a lot of people don't want to go to school. Same thing. So school avoidance or school non-attendance, emotionally based school non-attendance is a really big issue in the UK. And we do find evidence, and it makes absolute intuitive sense, that emotional burden within the classroom is a predictor of non-attendance. That's not rocket science, but it's an interesting alternative hypothesis. Whether that mediates or is mediated by depression and anxiety is another really interesting question. But it's no surprise that commonly upsetting experiences at a very high level intensely puts people off going to school. Not surprising. So yeah, we're exploring this as an outcome too. But also other outcomes had a very similar pattern. Loneliness. This is all cross-sectional, so it all could go the other way. It could be loneliness drives emotional burden, and obviously it's going to be transactional. Self-esteem. That's one of our key sort of secondary mediators. That a lot of this could be driven, in terms of my thriving model, could be driven by low self-esteem, lack of validation. The one that's actually slightly different, where it's only emotion regulation deficits, is well-being, which is actually the one I would have picked out was going to be the other way around, if anything. But I've always found well-being is a pretty bad, not that useful a construct personally, but that's not to decry this finding. It's the exception that proves the rule. So, we are scientists. This is a scientific study. What do you do when you get these results? You look at your hypothesis again. So we extended our hypothesis. Emotional burden, a source of significant unhappiness in itself, combines with emotion regulation difficulties, deficits, failures, to create mental health risk in the long run. That becomes our new hypothesis that we are now testing. So it's kind of a dual process model. And of course, I'm not going to illustrate it, but it doesn't take a genius to figure out that emotion regulation and emotional burden are probably going to interact as well, because you can imagine that being overwhelmed by intense emotional reactions to upsetting experiences is going to dissipate your regulatory skills. We know that from the depression research, anxiety research, that it reduces your resources to regulate your behavior. So yeah, we're going to study all of these. So we have a longitudinal study called the My Emotions Over Time, MIMO study. We've got lots of these little acronyms. My Emotions Over Time study, where we're measuring at 4 time points, 6 months apart, these constructs, to look at the cross-lagged paths between them. Up to 4 years, that's the plan. Is anybody rich in the audience who wants to give me some money? Because we haven't got the last bit funded yet. So we just need some extra funding to do the last bit of this very important study. That's a little advert. Okay, so that's the MIMO study. So that's exciting stuff. And if I ever get invited back to this wonderful country, I'll tell you about the results of the MIMO study, because it's kind of crucial. If there are no cross-lagged effects between emotion, burden, and mental health, then obviously the causal model isn't so as clear as we thought. Okay, so what about the last little bit? How am I doing? The last little bit? 5 minutes? Half hour? Great. But might be some questions. I'll do 10 minutes. 10 minutes. So the whole Restart was always considered a translational study. Our goal was always, as you remember, to develop an intervention. We were going to develop emotion regulation deficit interventions, like building up emotion regulation abilities in neurodivergent people to solve the depression epidemic that we're seeing. And of course, it completely changed the logic once you start to focus on emotional burden. Doesn't mean we're not interested in emotion dysregulation. As you've seen, we see that as an important contributory factor. But we want to do something original, so we focus on emotional burden. And so we developed something called Place Positive. This is within 4 years. It's pretty amazing. The power within this group, and the energy and the enthusiasm, which I do believe is a marker of a neurodivergent mind, is quite extraordinary. Exhausting, but extraordinary. So this was it. We basically did 12 months. The last part of the study was 12 months, where we really invested in developing this concept. We involved, obviously, the young people, but also we involved stakeholders within schools, because we've realized that schools are the best place to target, trying to help people manage their upsetting experiences in schools. And if you can't get the support of teachers and headmasters and headmistresses and school governors, it's never going to go anywhere. So they've all been involved, identifying the things they thought were important, as well as the young people. We instigated a new version of the Y-rappers, the J-rappers. So these were younger neurodivergent people, early adolescents. Now, we did this quite purposefully. We thought this is so novel that actually we don't want to go too young straight away, because we don't know how it's going to work with the older people. So we went that, and then the older people now mentor the J-rappers. So that's the kind of structure that we have. So what are the principles? Well, we immediately thought the whole point is really that there are no resources to support these young people. So you can't have an intervention that is very expensive, with loads and loads of human contact and lots of person involvement. So we basically went for a digital intervention that we felt was scalable across the whole of the UK, that had two, we call it a double-pronged approach. We want to change the school culture, so become more neurodiversity aligned, and we want to give practical skills to manage upsetting experiences, or we say navigate upsetting experiences to the young neurodivergent people, and support their teachers. So you can see it's a two-pronged approach. Our focus is preventative, obviously. This is an idea to reduce overall risk. It's universal. So the young our Y-rappers and our J-rappers, they said, please don't target neurodivergent kids with this intervention. We get enough stigma as it is. So it's a whole school, universal intervention, and delivered to the whole school. Although it's not aimed at neurodivergent people, it kind of is implicitly, but not in de facto. It is obviously designed by neurodivergent people to their benefit. Very solution-focused and, as I say, low cost. So the structure. So if you think about a digital platform, and we've been talking to various people. Microsoft have been a partner developing the concepts and ideas. Interesting working with such an enormous company. Very complicated politically and so forth. But anyway, we're still engaged, working together. And so you have a digital platform. You can imagine it like this. This is my drawing, isn't it? Really a bit clunky, but anyway. And so you have the first prong, is it cultural change activities that are delivered at the whole school level. Do you have assemblies in Turkey where all the kids come together at the start of the day? That sort of thing? Do you have that? Well, we have assemblies in England. It's a long tradition. So all the school kids come, from all the years, they come and sit in a hall like this and then have this assembly. So we develop things through assemblies and also group work. And the goal is there to, at the whole school level, young people.
I'm sorry to change the paradigm so quickly, but we have 5 minutes, I think. It's wrong. Yeah.
No problem. That's not really a paradigm shift. I don't know what it is. I don't think it's a paradigm. Anyway, I'll be very quick. It's just to give you a flavor, really, of this. So the second set of facilities are apps. One for the young person and one for the teacher. And for the student, it's to help navigate these upsetting experiences. Very practical, based on, obviously, their input. What they say, what are the biggest challenges they have, and what are ways that might be effective. Obviously, the literature, we've got a big literature on helping in these situations. And then for the teachers to build affirmative and supportive classroom for their kids. Then, of course, you've got to support the school leadership, because if putting these things in, they're going to need support too, and they have to support their teachers. Teachers in England, I don't know if it's the same here, they are undervalued, they're totally stressed out. Having to deal with neurodivergence probably doesn't help, and inclusive approaches is very, very exhausting. So we've got to support the teachers. And the other thing in the schools, a champion. There could be there'll be a student champion, so people promoting the engagement, and a teacher champion promoting the engagement. Very quickly, oh no, I haven't got 5. So yeah, so in terms of embedding it in, I'll just do that's Pebble. That's our little avatar that we use for the thing. It's quite cute. We went for Pebble because it seems resilient, but also quite approachable. If it was called Rocky, it might be a little bit aggressive, so we thought Pebble's better. Anyway, so you have your assembly, then that leads to class activities, then we introduce the apps, then we obviously, after the first term, we then review the situation and adjust accordingly. In terms of the teacher app, I'll just skip straight to the teacher app to give you an idea. So it's all obviously on a phone. This is the sort of, currently the design template. So the first active part of it is basically we ask them to walk in their students' shoes to get an idea of what aspects of classroom structure and organization they'd like us, or their own behavior, they'd like support and help on. Then they choose one of 6 gateways that we've identified through interviews and blah, blah, blah, blah. And you can see them there. This then leads on to toolboxes that are automatically then introduced. And then we send out, and a very neat idea that our digital partner, Toad, came up with was missions. So rather than just learning about stuff on the app, we actually send the teacher out with a task and get them to report back to Pebble after they've completed the task. And then so it's not got an AI component, but you can see it really could develop one very easily. Oh yeah, this is just how it works. I'll move that on. In terms of the student app, same concept. But in this case, they actually complete a mini Messi. Remember the Messi? The questionnaire, the 25 items? So they complete a mini one that then automatically identifies gateways that they have difficulty with, and then toolkits. So for instance, this one is about preparation for upsetting experiences. Be prepared. And that is, the mission is go out and think about your triggers. What is it? What are the kind of the predisposing contextual factors that lead to upsetting experiences? Where are they? And then come back and tell Pebble. Yeah. To always remind you know the film Wall-E? Do you know that film? Wall-E? Great film. It looks a bit, I always think it looks a bit like Wall-E. If you don't know it, you should watch it. It's a brilliant, brilliant film. Wall-E it is actually. Blah, blah, blah, blah. There we go. So you can see, this is a team of troublemakers called Restar. They're a wonderful team, absolutely incredible. I particularly like to highlight, I mean, everybody's made an incredible contribution. I particularly like to highlight one person, and that's Susie Chandler. She's been the program manager, and it's, if it wasn't for, she's the calmest, neurotypical person, so neurotypical that she compensates for the rest of us, which is brilliant, which is what we need. She's just amazing, wonderful, wonderful colleague. And then also mention Steve has been incredible, and Sylvan, who's the co-director, and he's a applied theatre guy. He's a professor at somewhere, Royal Central School for Speech and Drama, Swiss Cottage in London, very famous institution, and he brought all the co-intentionality, all the participatory stuff, and we had so many. He said, he used to say to me, we are violently agreeing again, Edmund, because we used to argue so much. We're agreeing violently. No, absolutely brilliant team. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk. And just 2 sentences from me first.
Yeah.
What I told when I was listening to you was, each conference we're organizing here is like a textbook. And we have chapters, like this ADHD chapter. And we are talking all about the small details many times. But when it comes to the first sentences of the chapter that everybody accepts from not questioning, that if you are questioning that, you have to be in a level that you have to have 30 years of experience and tons of citations. And it was a great experience for us to listen such a talk. This was mind-opening for me. Thank you so much. And for questions, we have like 7 minutes or so.
Sure. I mean, just to comment on that, I think courage is a quality of neurodivergent people. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah, great. Isran?
First of all, thank you for this terrific presentation. I have a question. As you mentioned that there are some results on ADHD, especially in MTA study. Margaret Sibley said that there are some ADHD symptoms fluctuating by years over age. And so I am wondering about what are the reflecting symptoms and what are the, how can I say, the risk factors for these fluctuating symptoms. So I am curious about your experience on this topic.
Sure, that's a great question. No, I think the paper, Maggie Sibley's analysis of the MTA data has been absolutely vital in highlighting the developmental course of ADHD. I mean, it's not directly related to this, but it is kind of in a way. It really isn't. Well, I remember 20 years ago, people were saying, lifetime condition, you've got to treat them every day for the whole of their lives with medication. And that wasn't the companies, that was actually the scientists saying that. It really isn't like that. It is incredibly fluctuating, both in terms of symptoms, but also in terms of impact, depending on context. What's, in a way, it's an indictment of the old paradigm that we know almost nothing about what the contexts are that drive those fluctuations. because it's been assumed to be an intrinsic property of the individual. And there probably are intrinsic aspects to it. But not to have looked at those contextual factors is kind of mad, crazy if you think about it. But it's because it's been so driven by this notion of intrinsic dysfunction that we've just not invested, or we've not, most people haven't looked at it. And so I don't know what the answer is in terms of what are the turning points, what are the contextual protective factors. You can kind of speculate. Obviously, changes in parenting could be very important. School could be really important, and so forth and so on. But I think that what's important about her work is that those boundaries are very fluid between getting enough to get a diagnosis and just missing a diagnosis. This is not like a standard classical disorder in any way. That's the way what I've taken from her brilliant study. And it's very interesting. I was just working on it this morning, actually. So I've been in the UK. The government are doing a big review on ADHD because they just don't know what to do with this incredible number of people getting diagnosed. So they've asked me in particular to focus on conceptual issues. And I was just writing about Maggie's paper this morning, highlighting the fluid nature of these diagnostic boundaries and whether diagnosis is even the right framework to think about this continuum that varies in terms of its impact over time. So that's another paradigm shift, I guess, that we need, but from a diagnostic or from a assessment and management perspective, perhaps. Yeah, that's great. Any other questions? Great stuff.
Thank you, for this presentation. I think the presentation was really impressive. I will read my question.
Thank you.
It encouraged us to try new approaches when we work with children who have different developmental challenges in daily practice, I think.
Yeah.
And also there was a major school attack in Turkey 2 days ago.
Oh.
And as a child psychiatrist, we have been discussing it for the last 2 days. It's also being discussed that this child may have ADHD and autism.
Oh.
When we think about this event, the presentation helped us to understand the main issues we should consider in such cases.
Interesting.
And I have 2 questions.
Okay.
First one is, do you think the term neurodiversity may reduce the seriousness of the condition for families or less experienced clinicians? Mm-hmm. And the second question is, ADHD or autism is not a single type. There are different forms, both in brain structure or symptoms. Mm-hmm. Do these differences overlap with the concept of neurodivergence?
Great. 2 great questions. Both questions are in the minds of a lot of people. I've been having a big debate over the last month with Steve Ferrone, who is a very strong advocate of the disorder framework. I think we've sort of come to a truce. But what was clear that both sides misunderstood the other person's perspective. Which relates directly to your questions. The concept of neurodiversity diminishing the seriousness, I think you might be right. I think it could do. I don't really use the context of neurodiversity apart from describing the philosophical framework. I talk about neurodivergence, so accepting that there are boundaries around the conditions. However, it's very tricky from a scientific perspective. You can't always be second-guessing the audience. If you know from your research that ADHD is a true continuum, there is literally no non-arbitrary boundary. You know that from your research. So what do you say? You pretend there is a non-arbitrary boundary? Do you see my point? You have to follow the science. I mean, if you're a scientist, you follow the science. Having said that, I think it's something you've got to be really aware of. But alternatively, the disorder paradigm has developed a disaster narrative around ADHD. That if you've got ADHD, your life is going to be a disaster. That's obviously pushed as well by the pharmaceutical industries. And the other bit of it is, as a therapist, I'm the only one who can save you. It's going to be a disaster, but if you let me help you, it'll be all right. That is a narrative around the disorder as well. So there are dangers on both sides, and we need to come up with something that is realistic and balanced. So, but I take your point. I agree with you, and I understand the concern, the worry. Oh yeah, I mean, I don't want to show off or anything, but I was the first person to propose that there were multiple brain systems involved in ADHD. 2001, I think the paper was, called a dual pathway model of heterogeneity in ADHD. So I absolutely agree with you. I think the benefit of the neurodiversity paradigm is it frees you up to think across boundaries, so transdiagnostically, but also detaching you from this notion that there is just a single thing that's gone wrong. So I think it's quite liberating to science in that regard. So I would say it's positive. And I would say the focus then is on the person and their environment, not on the disorder and the impairment. So the person can have these various subtypes, whether it's executive subtype or delay aversion subtype or emotion, whatever the brain system that's implicated in that particular group. But it is important to say, though, despite 20 years since 2001 of research trying to identify reliable subtypes based on brain structure and function, we don't have any yet. That is it. So conceptually, it makes absolute sense. Empirically, it should work, and it's plausible, but we actually have not developed a reliable endophenotype for a brain subtype yet. I would say, anyway. Other people might disagree. Great questions. Thank you.
We can take the questions personal, I think. Just
I'll try and be quicker. Sorry, I tend to talk too much. Sorry.
burada bitirmek zorundayız. Bütün salon burada. Salona çok teşekkür ediyorum. Gerçekten hani başından sonuna çok büyük bir dikkatle dinlediler. Just gossiping in Turkish. O yüzden hepinize çok teşekkür ederim. Burada keselim ama sorulara devam edelim. Biz buradayız. Birlikte sormuş olalım. Çok teşekkür ediyorum herkese.
Thank you.